to start a talk with lots of jargon. But hopefully it'll be fun and we'll learn a little bit more that will help us keep the internet safe. Because keeping the internet safe is nice. We like a safer internet. But before I get into that, let me tell you a little bit about myself. Hi, I'm Jen. Everybody. So I'm a developer advocate at Google. I've been doing that for a few years. I bounced off different projects. In the past I did stuff that was more focused on the software development side, mobile apps, that kind of stuff. I previously worked on Firebase and Google Glass at Google+. But around 2016, I started seeing a lot of organizations getting hacked, and that made me sad. So I'm like, I'm going to take a little bit of a pivot towards cybersecurity stuff, and I'm going to see if I can hopefully make this better. And although most of my research focused on application security, because, software developer background, I did discover this thing called web authentication along the way, and it seemed like some of the lowest hanging fruits for internet security, so I started giving talks about it. I also think it's just generally a pretty cool technology. But enough about me. Let me find out a little bit more about all of you. Questions, raise your hand if the answer is yes or true. So how many of you know what those abbreviations are, FIDO and WebAuthn? One, like semi, okay, this is great, because this is a general introduction on the topic. Every once in a while, there's somebody who's done like a bunch of implementations. Like, we'll chat afterwards. But great, this talk is for all of you. How many of you are like an administrator of like a Google Apps account, or have a lot of privileges on a GCP console, or a Firebase console, or maybe like Android signing keys? Cool, a good number of you. Yeah, this is something that will be very useful to you because it can do a lot to reduce your damage if something bad were to happen. How about the flip side of that? How many of you have commit access to some open source library that somebody else uses? Okay, a few people. Unfortunately, in the place we are in the world now, people are starting to do these things called supply chain attacks, where even if we just do a little rinky-dinky login library that we think is kind of neat, people are actually starting to target us directly so they can get at people who use our library. So it's kind of sad that we're less safe than we used to be. And finally, account takeovers, phishing attacks. How many of you have been involved in cleaning up from one of these, whether it's like just yourself or helping a family member or coworker recover from their own account getting hacked? Oh, the hands are starting to go up now. No one will make any fish themselves. It's a shameful thing. But yeah, it's like a total pain in the neck to clean up, isn't it? Especially if somebody doesn't even know all of the other secondary accounts that might be impacted. Well, that's where this technology comes in. Hopefully it'll make sure that that doesn't happen anymore. Not just for us, but for all of our users as well. And here's how we're going to approach it. We're going to start by talking about the problem. We're going to talk about user authentication as it exists today. Super exciting topic. I think Auth is exciting. Then we're going to dive into the solution to the current problems with those abbreviations and acronyms, FIDO and WebAuthn. And we're going to kind of take that from a more abstract phase to a more we're going to kind of concretify it as we go and add more and more layers of detail. Then I'm going to talk about how you can use that technology to protect yourself, because a lot of us have access to the keys to our organization, and it's important that we protect ourselves first so that people who use our libraries and people who depend on us, they stay safe. And also it's important that we set a good example. And then finally, the last step is adding support to the software that you administrate or you write, because this is a technology that can help keep our users safe too. And then we have to deal with fewer support requests about them getting their accounts taken over. And that's always a win. And we can spend more time writing software and making things scale, what we're actually paid to do. So first, authentication and a little bit of threat modeling. Here is kind of the state of the art for user authentication, at least as of the 1960s and 70s. Users are identified by a username, some kind of identifier that is not a secret. And then they have some other shared secret, like a password, that they remember, and they share with the third-party system, like a mainframe or something, at the time their account is created or after they're authenticated to do an update. And it's great and all, and it just won't seem to die, despite the fact that we knew the whole time there were problems with this authentication technique, using that shared secret, that password. And we've done a lot to try and educate users to work around these limitations we've known. We taught people to use strong passwords with lots of entropy in them that are hard to guess. And that was great. It was actually a really good set of education. It makes a big difference when you do this education if you're protecting against the threat of somebody guessing their password by brute force, sitting down at their mainframe terminal or something like that. But we don't live back then anymore. Now we live on the internet, and we don't have like 4 or 5 accounts that we might have had back then. Now we have hundreds. Like I have hundreds and hundreds of accounts now. I'm sure a lot of us do too. And people went to those trainings and they tried really hard. The typical user is going to try as hard as they can to make sure that things stay secure. So they came up with these awesomely difficult to guess passwords, which is great, except there was a different part of the training that didn't really stick, which is password reuse. So once they come up with that amazing password that meets every single one of those password rules out there, they're going to use it on every site they can. Or maybe they'll change a number at the end every once in a while to make it fit into some set of password constraints. And this gave rise to a whole nother set of attacks that we didn't really anticipate way back then when we wrote those trainings, which is an attack called credential stuffing. And the way it works is we have a user log into password stuff, and they log into a service, like their work and all that. They use this awesome password. It works great. Oh, wait. But they actually use it at other services, too. And one of those other services, some random site might be breached. Or it might be a service that was set up just to harvest passwords. Like it might be some silly app that does something weird to your face or something like that. It's like, sign up for an account. People will put in their email address and the same magic password they use everywhere into those apps also. For whatever reason, that password gets breached. Either someone will hack in and steal 1 million passwords and then decrypt them, or whatever, potentially they didn't use a good way to store those passwords, or somebody spends a lot of time to try and reverse those passwords with some other cryptographic techniques. Either way, people get a big ball of passwords. And this is actually becoming a pretty widespread problem. People are taking these passwords and they're glomming together into these big old password sets. For example, earlier this year, there was a set of passwords. There was 2.2 billion combinations of email addresses and passwords that was floating around. And this isn't information that's like buried deep on the dark web. This was just linked from a bunch of tweets. Like there was a series of tweets that linked to S3 bucket files, and you could just go download them. And it was pretty incredible. Like I found myself inside files. I didn't even download all the files. I just downloaded a few of them, and I found a bunch of my old accounts in there too. So it's clear that people are taking those breaches and building these huge sets of logins and passwords. So what they do then is they take those logins and passwords and they go try that email address and that super awesome password in a whole bunch of other services that might be more important. Financial institutions, email accounts, other corporations. And then they compromise that account, take it over, and cause all sorts of damage. And that's sad. And that's actually a really common attack that's happening now at scale. You can script it. You can try and stuff thousands of accounts. You can go on YouTube and find how to use credential stuffing to get free Spotify and stuff like that. It's all over the place now. But you might be saying to yourself, we already have a solution to that problem. It's called one-time passwords. The way one-time passwords work, also called 2FA, a second factor, which is kind of a generic term. But specifically, one-time passwords as a kind of second factor work like this. In addition to your login and your password, there's also some other code that you enter that changes over time. And this can be accomplished in a variety of ways. Maybe you share a secret with the server. In addition to sharing the password with the server synchronizes, you give them your cell phone number. And then they send you that code over the back channel SMS, and you punch it in. Or maybe you share a secret ahead of time using an application on your mobile device or even a physical device like we've been having for years. I remember at one point I had a big old keychain with 20 of those things on it. It was great. It wasn't actually great. I'm trying to figure out each one each time. And these are good. The ones on this side are better than the ones on the other side. Try and avoid SMS ones if you can, because there's other attacks happening involving SIM swaps. They're sad too, but we're not talking about those today. These are great because they protect against credential stuffing and a bunch of other attacks, but they don't protect against every kind of attack. There are, for example, one of the common ones that people like us are starting to get targeted with is really specific targeted phishing attacks. And these are becoming a bigger problem. And a targeted phishing attack is surprisingly effective. I've had the pleasure of being able to participate in some offensive security exercises during my career, and targeted phishing attacks work on like 50% of software developers and sometimes 20% of security engineers. It's amazing how effective they are if you target them correctly. But essentially the way it works is you have a service you want to compromise, and you set up a fake service that looks kind of like that, or maybe it looks like some other service that the person will use. You get them to enter all that information into your fake service, including their one-time password. And then you relay that with automation over to the real service, get an authenticated session, and go cause all your damage. And targeted phishing attacks aren't just like random emails that come out with like poor typography and stuff like that. Targeted phishing attacks might be things like figure out when somebody's buying a home and then sending them a fake DocuSign page. Something where someone's trained to click through, or targeting early in the morning before they've had their coffee. Things like that are surprisingly effective. It's a psychology game. But anyway, this doesn't really help very much at all. One-time passwords don't help very much at all for this kind of use case. And there's other kinds of attacks too, but I had to pick one. But I think the fundamental issue on this particular threat and a whole bunch of other similar threats is the way we interact with our services. Because we're not like telepathically using our services. We don't go up and like telepathically authenticate. We have a user interface that we use to use our service. And that is the same user interface we're using to do authentication. And that inherently is imperfect. Because in addition to recalling that password that you might have used, you're actually spending a lot of time evaluating, using a whole bunch of heuristics in your brain to figure out if that is a real site, to figure out if that is legitimate and that is valid. And that is an arms race against people who are trying to make convincing fakes. And that's too much of a burden to put on people 100 times a day. We need to find a way to reduce that cognitive load so that you can get into your application and do what you need to do, and you don't need to spend a whole bunch of energy figuring out if it's real. And that's where web authentication comes in. So let's talk about a solution. How do we solve this problem once and for all? Probably unsurprisingly, cryptography is going to be involved. Cryptography's fun. Yay! So, a quick recap on public key cryptography. Probably review for a lot of you. But public key cryptography, also two-key asymmetric cryptography, is a really cool wrinkle in mathematics where we can generate a pair of numbers, a private key and a public key. And they have this really cool property that when I take a message or a piece of information and I process it with one of those keys, for example, if I encode it with the yellow key, I can only read it with the green key. And the most useful versions of this particular kind of mathematics also work in both directions. So if I take my message or my number or whatever and I encode it with the green key, then I can only read it if I am in possession of the yellow key. And we know that this can be used to send messages back and forth without a third party intercepting it, but we can use it for authentication too. So, let's talk about how we use this for authentication at the most abstract level, and we're going to kind of dig our way in. So, whenever we do authentication, taking a little step back, we actually have two different phases that we have to do. We have to do registration, which is either like when you create a new account or when you add a new authentication method to an existing account, which is a whole separate process, a separate dance. And then, which we'll only really register once usually, or rarely, but then we authenticate every time we need to use the service again. So we're going to go through those in order. First, registration. So I have a user, they have a service they want to use, they have some web server. Yay! The user somehow generates a key pair, a green key and a yellow key. Maybe they do this with software, maybe they do it by hand on a notepad. You could, it would just take a really long time. Doesn't really matter. Then they transmit that key over to the server, hopefully using a secure way of transporting that, like transport layer security, HTTPS. But it's actually not really necessary for us in this case. Anyway, they find a way to get the green key over to the server. The server stores that green key, and then our registration is essentially done. We just need a way to get a key over to the server that is a sibling, a pair, a match for a key that we keep safe, that we don't let anybody else see. Once we've done that, we can use it to authenticate. The way we do that is the next time we connect to the server goes, hey, we did a key trade before. I'm going to generate some gibberish, some cryptographically super good randomness gibberish. And I'm going to toss it over to you. you're going to take it and you're going to encode it using the key that you kept private, because I know you kept it private and didn't share it with anyone. It's going to be only readable to me, and then you're going to send it back. And the server is going to verify that signed challenge. You're going to decrypt it, and what that guarantees is that the person I'm talking to is the person who has kept that yellow key safe. And they're successfully authenticated without doing any common shared secret. And this solves our problem at a high level, but there's still a lot of detailed problems in this. We haven't really solved phishing yet. We're going to get into that as we progress through the detail. But the gist of it sounds good? Pretty simple, pretty straightforward? Okay. Awesome. Okay, so let's make it concrete. This is where we throw away that notepad where we're doing all the cryptography by hand, because that's really error-prone. And we're going to use hardware and protocols to solve the problem, because web protocols make everything better. Standardization. Yay! So let's talk about the hardware, and then we'll talk about the protocol. First, the hardware. So that notepad is great for doing a little bit of cryptography, but we need to move on to something that actually does it for us. Web authentication has a couple of different general ways of doing that cryptography. There is the old but awesome technique of using a security key, also known as a security dongle. These look a lot like the ones that you plug in and you hit a button and a bunch of numbers show up on your screen. Although they appear identical, web authentication actually uses a different way of transmitting that. Much bigger sets of data fly back and forth. But they usually look like a little thing with a little USB thing on it, USB-A or USB-C. Maybe they have a near-field communication antenna in them, so you can touch it to an Android phone, and it'll be able to send information back and forth. Or maybe you're using iOS, and Bluetooth is the only way to do that communications thing. But in any case, you have some way to transmit it over that. All the private keys, the yellow keys, stay secure on these devices, which is pretty cool. It makes you more secure, because even if your host device, your laptop or phone, gets compromised, the attacker would have to find another vulnerability to actually extract the key out of that device. So in that case, even if your laptop is compromised, the web authentication conversation is still going to properly authenticate you, which is actually kind of moot, because then they can get your cookies, but that's another problem. But the gist of it is your key stays secure on this device, it does the signing, and you can move it between different computers. I can have one key, I can use it on my workstation, on my laptop, and so on. They're great. Most people don't want to carry around those devices anymore. So web authentication now supports platform authenticators, which is an innovation over the previous protocol called U2F. Platform authenticators are great. I think they're what's going to make this actually work for everyone else in the world. The way platform authenticators work is they live on your host device. And we live in a nice time around for this kind of technology, because a lot of our laptops, a lot of our phones have these new secure hardware enclaves, which are really good at keeping private keys private, even if that device has been compromised. They also have biometric authentication that they might use to protect information in those secure hardware enclaves, like the laptop I have in front of me and many of the phones we have today. And that's awesome too, because we can totally use those as authenticators also. Okay, so you have a hardware that'll do your cryptography, either the secure hardware enclave on your device, or you're carrying around a security dongle. Now, let's talk about the protocol, the little dance that we use to do the registration and authentication in a little bit more detail, and how it actually protects against those attacks. And right now, the protocol is a little bit of a jargon mess, but let's try and detangle that mess a little bit. So, first, FIDO. I wish their mascot was a dog. It doesn't seem to be. FIDO actually stands for Fast Identity Online, and that's the organization, the standards body that wrote the standard. It also refers to the specifications, which is a little bit of a retcon, like they went back and changed the meaning of acronyms in history, which is why Google searches are a little confusing right now. But anyway, FIDO2 refers to the overall umbrella, like the group of specifications, the super specification. And the specification involves a user who wants to log into things, and a service. The server they're connecting to is called a relying party in the specification. Doesn't really matter why. You'll see relying party all over the place if you dig into this more. Security keys, security dongles are called removable security keys, and built-in ones are called platform and occasionally built-in. Removable ones are also sometimes called roaming in the spec. You get used to it. There is another wire protocol that's used. It's a very low-level protocol that's used by the security keys to communicate with the client. The web browser talks in this protocol over like USB human interface device, or NFC, and it speaks in a binary protocol called CTAP. You don't really need to worry too much about CTAP, although you will see it. If you're buying a key, it will sometimes say what version of CTAP it supports. One of the big things where they went back and changed the meaning of a historical acronym is U2F. U2F used to refer to a previous version of the overall spec. Now it refers to CTAP 1, which is the old wire protocol. All you really need to know is that if you want to get a key that supports 502, or it might advertise that it supports CTAP 2. And that has a bunch of new shiny features that I'm not actually covering, but it's a little bit, it has some other features around passwordless security that nobody actually supports yet. But you'll be future-proof. But if you have if you have an old U2F or CTAP 1 key, those work fine too. It's reverse and forward compatible. And then the part we actually care about, WebAuthn. WebAuthn is the part of the protocol that communicates between the user's client and the server, which is the stuff that us as software developers and IT people will encounter the most. This is the stuff we actually need to write the code. These are the client libraries we're going to use. And this is also the only unique term within the new protocol, so people use it to refer to the whole protocol sometimes, just because it's disambiguates pretty well. Okay. Jargon done. WebAuthn, that's what we care about. CTAP 2, look for it when you buy a key. Everything else, you can kind of ignore. So, time to concretify the specification a little bit. Let's talk about registration first. We're going to do this a couple of times more. Registration, then authentication. So, a user is signing up for a new account, or they are adding a security key to their existing account. What's actually happening behind the scenes is this. Most of the time on the web, the story is said from a new user, which is not the typical case. The vast majority of the time, registration is going to happen when you have an existing user with an existing account and they are adding a security key to their account. So that's the way I'm going to phrase it here. It's a little bit different than most people seem to discuss it. They're connecting to a server, a relying party. They are already logged in. They've already logged in with a password, or maybe they just created a new account. They're going to click a button on a web page or on a mobile app that says, I want to register a new key. And the server is going to go, okay, that sounds great. Here's a challenge, and here's my relying party ID. The challenge is cryptographically good, high-quality randomness. The relying party ID has to match the origin, the domain name of the server. This is used to prevent phishing. Basically, throughout the conversation, the server is going to keep saying, this is my relying party ID, this should match the origin. And it gets checked by everything downstream. The client is going to, in the browser, check that origin matches that relying party ID, and it's going to send the information to the security key. The security key is going to check that they match again on the security key itself. It will then generate a new pair of keys, either using its own built-in randomness source, or it will use the randomness in the challenge that the server sent it. Most of the keys, in fact, everyone I've been able to find uses that as its randomness source for generating that key pair. That's important because we have to send it a good amount of, the specification says how much randomness you have to send to the key. Then it's going to sign the challenge, and it's going to send back that public key that it generated. It's going to send back a credential ID, which is a descendant of, it's basically an identifier. It's a handle for the key on the security dongle. And it's going to echo the origin that it saw back to the server, so the server can check again that the origin matches the origin it expects. On the server side, it's going to verify all of that stuff, look at those signatures, make sure they all look nice and shiny. It's going to set a counter to 0 and store that, which will become apparent later. That's an anti-cloning technology, like an anti-cloning technique. And then it will save that public key and the credential ID to its system. Good implementations also support multiple sets of credential IDs and public keys so that you can have multiple keys for an account. Sometimes people need to share accounts. It's going to happen. Support multiple keys. Only about half of the implementations out there do that today, but I hope more do soon. Okay, so we now registered. We only have to do that once. Let's talk about the authentication phase. So in this phase, the user logs in, and the server goes, hey, you have a security key. I'm going to make you verify your identity with that. You have registered 2 security keys. They have these 2 credential IDs. And here's a nice new set of cryptographically random information in the form of a challenge. You send over the credential IDs so we can find the key, but also the browser is actually going to do a quick check all on the client side to verify that like this key is present. It just saves a round trip if the wrong key is in. But it's going to pass that information off to the key. It's going to verify all the same stuff again, that origin matches. It's going to look up and find that private key. It's going to increment an internal counter, which it didn't actually discuss before with the server, but it's going to increment its own internal counter. Then it's going to sign all that information and send it on back to the server. Similar thing now, except now we have, in addition to the sign challenge and the origin, we have a counter which has incremented. And this can actually be a shared counter across many different services to make those keys cheap to construct. The server is going to verify stuff. It's going to verify that challenge, the signature is correct. It's going to check all the origin and all that. And it's going to verify that counter. And when it verifies the counter, it verifies that that number is higher than the number it saw before. During registration, it's set as 0, so it's expecting a number that is higher than 0. The reason the counters are there is kind of a bonus feature, which is detecting clones. So most of the keys are actually pretty good at preventing somebody from cloning them. Like they do a bunch of secure hardware implementations in there, but it's not actually required by the specification. To work around this, what we do is we look at the counter. If there is a cloned key, we're going to see the counter go backwards at some point. Because if you have two perfect clones, you actually can't tell which one is the real one. All you can use is their memory after the time they were cloned to detect that that clone exists. And the way we do that is with this simple counter. So at some point, you're going to authenticate, and one of those keys is going to keep counting up, 40, 50, 60, and then someone's going to plug in that clone key, and it's still going to have 42 on it, and it's going to see a 43, and it's going to be like, uh-oh. Hey, yo, like, there's two keys that have the same key on them. That shouldn't exist. Like, I'm just going to log your whole account now, and we're going to go through some backup authentication. Go call support. So it doesn't detect which one is the clone, but it will tell you if a clone has happened only after when the second key gets used. So the damage might be done, but hey, at least you get a heads up. Okay, so that's actually the protocol in like more concretified form. There's a whole bunch of other features around like whitelisting certain keys and stuff like that, and passwordless login. I haven't talked about any of that because it goes, it's too much to talk about in this time. But hopefully that convinces you that we've actually solved the phishing problem. Hopefully. Okay, so maybe I convinced you that this is a technology that is cool, that will keep account takeovers from happening quite as often. We deployed it at Google. We've been using it for years, and account takeovers have just not been an issue since, which is kind of crazy for an organization as large as us. We have press releases we publish. We have had basically no full account takeovers since then, which is amazing, which is why I'm up here talking about it, because I really think it can help. So, how do you use this to protect yourself? First, step 1, get an authenticator. You might already have one in your pocket right now. Maybe you want the full-blown security key, so you can use it on your workstation and only have one shared everywhere. If you want to get a security key, there are a bunch of vendors out there. I'm going to recommend a few. Yubico has been making hardware-backed security devices, including web authentication devices, for a long time. They make the Cadillac versions. They have keys that will not just do web authentication, they'll do all sorts of other stuff too. You can use them to like sign, you store your SSH keys and do GPG signing, and they'll support the older method where it spits stuff out as a keyboard emulation. They'll do all those things. They're the most expensive. They have some cheaper ones too, but they're a great option to consider. They also have a newer version that supports Lightning, which for iOS devices, which I've ordered, but I haven't actually gotten to play with yet. If you all like open source stuff, solo keys are the open source option. Open source hardware, open source software, you could build one yourself from scratch, or you can order one from them for like $15. They're also one of the cheapest options, especially one of the cheapest USB-C options. And we have our own Titan key bundle, which conveniently comes with 2 keys, so you have a backup. And we support all the different protocols, NFC for Android phones, USB-A, and Bluetooth for iOS. So go pick your bundle. I usually, when I get a pack of keys for an organization, I'll usually go with the solo keys. But Yubico has some cool stuff too, like that little tiny USB-C one. Super convenient. Okay, so you've gotten a key, or you found a platform authenticator you already own. Let's go register it on some important sites. So I'm going to drag you through one right now, just show you what the registration actually looks like from the user perspective on GitHub, because I think GitHub has a great implementation. So first we're going to register, and then we'll authenticate. So I'm already logged in. For GitHub, you have to have already set up two-factor authentication with either SMS or paper codes or something. Once you do that, this security key thing is going to show up on the screen. Go down, click Add, and scroll down past all these warnings, just ignore them for now. You will name your key, because good implementations have handles, nicknames for all the keys, and support multiple keys. I'll call this one Solo A. I'll click Add, and this is actually going to trigger the registration API. My key is going to give me some visual signal, in this case an LED turned yellow, and it's registered. Registration, a whole bunch of stuff happened in the background, but it was really just that simple as a user. Now, if I just go sign out and sign back in, using my super awesome login and password. Ooh, someone's excited. Now, GitHub's going to remember that we just registered a key, and it'll be like, hey, go plug that key in, it's going to change color, I'm going to tap it, and hey, I'm logged in. It's actually super fast. It's way faster than going and getting a code from an application or an SMS. So just that easy. You should all go add it to your GitHubs now, so your GitHub doesn't get hacked, so people don't involve you in the middle of a supply chain attack. GitHub also supports platform authenticators and all that too. The slightly more kind of advanced twist on it, let's talk about administrating Google GCP projects and Google Apps domains. On admin.google.com, you can set it up for your own accounts, just by going to accounts@google.com. But for your organization, you can actually set policies around how those keys are deployed, which is pretty cool. You can delay enforcement, so they have a month to go pick up a key from the IT desk. But I think my favorite feature, which as far as I can tell is unique to Google stuff right now, is you can pick a group filter for security key policy. So you can be like, I'm going to create a Google group, the mailing list of all the people who have access to the Android signing keys. I can force just them, or just people who have billing administration on GCP. I can force just them to use security keys, which is great because it's way easier to handle my 10 most sensitive users that would be a catastrophe if they got pwned versus like 1,000 users in my organization. So definitely an option to consider. If you just set the enforcement policy, it'll actually pop up something when they log in. You can like, hey, go get a security key. It actually, the world's worked pretty well. And there are lots of other places that support it. There are a whole bunch of websites that kind of have a list of this. DongleAuth.info is one bound by NitroKey, which is another key vendor. They have a whole big old list of everyone who supports two-factor and web authentication. But a quick summary of sites that also support it: Facebook, Dropbox, Twitter. Twitter's implementation only supports one key. They should support more than one, especially for Twitter's use case. But anyway, GitLab, Fastmail, AWS. Go set it up at all those places. And of course, your Gmail account. And I'm pretty sure, I haven't added it yet, but I'm pretty sure Microsoft's Azure also supports it now. I think that just came out. Finally, let's talk about adding support to your software in, we have some time, in a few minutes. So, you've now gotten your organization tidy, you've locked down all your accounts, you have deployed it, the 20 sites that support it. What's really cool is you can use one key across 20 sites, and they can't figure out that you're using the key. You know, if they have the back channel share that, they can't correlate your identity with those keys. So feel free to use your key anywhere it supports. It's awesome. You're super secure now. You can turn on Google Advanced Protection. Not going to get pwned anymore. Yay! But now you're at the point where, like, okay, I want to make this available to my users so that we can reach critical mass and keep everyone on the internet safe. Let's talk about that. I wanted to come up here and spend 10 minutes live coding an implementation on a toy application. I'm afraid to admit we're not there yet. So site support is pretty good. The security keys are exceptional. Browser support is like top-notch now. Pretty much everything except iOS, Safari. But in terms of client library support, we're not quite there for a live codable implementation yet. So I'm going to kind of walk you through some code, and I'm going to show you some like things I learned by doing a whole bunch of implementations. So first, client libraries. WebAuthn.io, which I'll link on the last slide, is a website set up by a company called Duo Labs, and they actually have probably the best directory of client libraries out there right now. So they have for your favorite language, whether it's .NET or Java or Go or whatever. The client libraries vary a little bit in maturity. The Java client library is pretty mature. The Python library is pretty good. Like the Ruby one is not as mature yet. And you can see the version numbers are lower on some of them. But go give them a poke. These generally focus on the server side of the WebAuthn part of the protocol. They generally don't do much for the client side of it at all yet. So go use a client library. This handles all of the heavy lifting, all the nasty crypto stuff. don't roll your own crypto. Even be careful when you're using good crypto libraries. Be cautious. It's easy to cause problems. These client libraries will get you in a safer place. But pay attention to the version number first. So let's talk a little bit about that client-side part of the implementation, where you'll probably be writing most of your code. I'm going to talk about web browsers now, because even if you're writing a mobile app, the easiest way to get WebAuthn working is just to kick that phase of the authentication to a web browser. It is WebAuthn, after all. And there is another wonderful site also set up by Dual Labs called WebAuthn.guide, and I'm going to kind of use it to go through a few of the things on later, not during my talk. I kind of go through some of the stuff I learned while doing a bunch of implementations. So I'm going to scroll past all of the information, but they also discuss it in registration and then authentication. Surprise, surprise. They have a little cute cartoon here. Beautiful illustration on this website. They walk you through essentially that same high-level process. But they also show code snippets, which is where it gets exciting. That's as zoomed in as I can get. So the text is a little small, especially in the back. I apologize. Just go back to the site later and just remember the things I said based on the rough shape of the code. So the user hits the button that says, I want to register a key. You just call a built-in browser API, because this is a browser method. Seems really cool and all. It only takes one parameter. Should be easy, right? Well, that one parameter is actually pretty big, and it has like a whole bunch of different optional things. So let's talk about that real quick. First off, you're going to have a challenge that you need to get from the server to the client so they can do this part of the dance. You can send that over via JavaScript is the most typical way. You could also just burn it into the page at render time. Generating entropy is pretty cheap on the server. I've done that. It works okay. You just burn a challenge into every single possible click this button to add a security key page. Works fine. You gotta send that over. The only weird gotcha here is the encoding. I think this is to make the wire protocol easier to implement, but the browser method takes this, what comes over from the server. So what comes over from the server is generally a string, like a base64 encoded string of randomness. And we have to convert that into everybody's favorite format on web programming, which is an array of integer representation of binary data of the UTF-8 encoding of that string. Which is crazy, but you can actually do it with only a couple lines of code. You're just going to have to do it every time you implement. It's awkward. Relaying party, RP, this is where the server identifies itself. This is how we do that phishing protection. You give your ID, which should match your origin, your domain name. You give a name, which shows up on the browser consent dialogues. So the user knows it's coming from you and not somehow from someone else. User information, the user already has to exist at the time you add the key. So you either have to do it at the end of the registration process or add it to an existing user. You're going to specify a user ID, which has to be a non-human readable ID. Again, in that weird format, the gibberish format of binary stuff. You give a user ID, which is usually a name, which is usually going to be an email address or the actual internal ID you use, and a display name. There's also an icon URL, which is technically required by the specification. The specification doesn't really do a good job of explaining why the icon has to be there. It changes the reason in a few different parts. Most of the client libraries and browser implementations just ignore that and declare that required field optional. Whatever, it's optional now. Now for the optional fields that are kind of optional. First, public key credential parameters. You can specify what encryption technology, what scheme of AES key or what key of SHA or elliptic curve, what algorithm you're using to do the cryptography. There's a standardized number you use for it. You can ignore this. There's only 3 different methods in the specification, and every single key I've gotten my hands on supports exactly those 3 specs. So if you just leave it off, optional, that's fine. But if you have some weird compliance reason that you have to use this version of elliptic curve, you can specify it. Authenticator selection, just ignore this one. You can actually specify that you require cross-platform, the roaming keys, if you want to. I've never seen a need to do it. Timeout, which is technically optional, but is actually required. You want to give a timeout. That's how long the user has to hit the button on the key. The default in Chromium browsers is like 1 second, which is not enough time. The Firefox implementation, the Safari implementation are a little bit longer by default, but just set it to like a minute is what everybody does. And then finally, attestation. Almost all the examples turn this on to direct, turn it to none, or leave the field off entirely. This is for allowing you to whitelist and blacklist certain keys. So unless you need to be like FIPS keys only or something, you can use this to specify FIPS keys. You can also use it to blacklist keys manufactured somewhere you don't want them to be manufactured. That's great and all, but for the vast majority of us, just set that to none. or leave blank, and that just allows them to use any key they have, which will make the platform authenticators work more broadly and allow you to support future authenticators you haven't seen yet. This is how, like, if you use this protocol on Vanguard supports WebAuthn. If you use Vanguard WebAuthn, they use attestation to require only Yubico keys. That's a bummer. I wish they didn't do that, but okay, they can. Okay, then you finally call that method, and the rest of the dance happens. On the server side, okay, so what happens on the client is a credential object comes back out, which is a whole bunch of binary information. All you really need to do with this, you encode it into a format you can send over the wire, you base64 encode it, you send it back to the server via JavaScript as a form field somehow. Get it back to the server. The server does a validation, which we'll dig into a little bit more here. There we go. The validation is actually a 19-step process with a whole bunch of super phases. This is really, if you're using a client library, you really just decode that information and pass it right back to the client library. There's a whole bunch of stuff here where it goes through how to crack open that binary data and slice off the different sets of bits. You shouldn't be doing that. Just let your client library handle it. There'll be C4 decoding and all that. Okay, and at that point, you just store a few things that your client library tells you to store. Those credential IDs, and the user ID, and then you just store that. Now it's part of the account. You just have to, if it's there the next time the user tries to log in. Registration is done. Time for authentication. Authentication has a much longer, cute little cartoon, but the code is actually much easier. Now you're going to call a different method, navigator.credentials.get. So the server will trigger the browser to call this when you know a key has been registered for that account already. The big blob of data you pass to it is actually much smaller than it was before. You're typically just going to say, you're going to send a credential ID back in and a challenge, encoded the same way you did during registration. You can lock it down to specific transports during authentication. So you can say USB only or Bluetooth only. Don't bother with that. And again, the optional but really required timeout. Once you get to this phase, it's actually pretty easy to implement. Server-side validation is much of the same. You take that information that comes back out of that method, that came back out of the key, base64 encode it, get it back to the server somehow. You get 4 different fields to base64 encode this time. And all you really do is pass them on to your client library again. You verify them. This is, again, another like 17-point process underneath. It's kind of ugly to do by hand. Don't do it by hand. It's scary. Let your client library handle it. But the end result is you're going to get back out a true or a false and an updated counter that you'll store. Pretty easy. Users are authenticated. You'll be doing that every time they log in. So, not live codable, but it's something that you can realistically get working in under a day in most instances. And you'll probably want to get a little more time to verify that it's working, because account lockouts are costly, and messing up cryptography can be even more costly. But totally not that bad now. But let's talk a little bit about the realities and the gotchas. So, one of the first things people always ask about is, what about lost keys? What if my users lose their security keys and they get locked out of their accounts? This is the first thing that comes to our mind. But the truth is, this is much less of a problem than you would expect. First off, you should support multiple keys. Then a user can register multiple keys. They can store one in a safe somewhere or something like that. I don't know where they store them, back at home. That will help mitigate this problem. But the truth is, if they lose their key, we just do what we've always done when they forget their password. We fall back to a different form of authentication. If it's a self-service application, maybe you'll send an email reset. If you're at an enterprise organization, you might make them swing by the help desk and have them check their badge. Fall back to a different form of authentication. Way less of a problem than you would expect. Problems that are real is that iOS support is lagging. It's getting really close. The Safari desktop version, developer preview, now has a really good WebAuthn implementation. Unclear when that's actually going to make it into their production versions. So right now that's the one big limitation. You can't really use it everywhere yet. Once that gets working, I think it will spread like wildfire. The other thing is that the client libraries are young. It's not a deal breaker, but give your implementation time. Be careful. Think carefully about deploying, 0.0, 0.1 client library code to production. Maybe spin off of the microservice and use a more mature library. And when you're doing an implementation, even if you're just doing the client-side WebAuthn, you're gonna have to crack open that spec at some point. People's documentation has gotten pretty good, but the FIDO organization, their docs are the spec. So at some point you're going to go like, what the heck is with this, this profile URL? Okay, go back to the spec. It's like, oh, okay, I can ignore that. You're still going to have to crack it on. But it's not a bad spec. It's not like the 3,000 page Bluetooth spec. It's like only about 70 or 80 pages of spec you actually have to pay attention to. Way better, believe it or not. And then finally, my last minute, make some good choices. If you're doing an implementation, please, I'll repeat again, support more than one key per account. The spec doesn't require it, it just encourages it. It'll save you a lot of headache. Don't use attestation unless you really need to. Oh, there's only 2 good choices to make. Yeah. Don't use attestation if you really need it. And here are a bunch of useful links. You can get to these slides from gen.1/WA, Web Authentication, and then these will all link off to all the sites, every resource I use for this, including some other bonus documentation that digs into a bunch of those features I didn't talk about, like passwordless authentication and stuff. Like especially Ackerman Yuri's blog posts are amazing if you want to dig deeper into this stuff. So with that, thank you all very much for coming to a talk about security. I know it's a painful thing to do at an exciting developer conference where you can learn all sorts of other fun things, but security can be fun too. And I'll be hanging around if you want to chat, ask questions. Definitely grab me in the hallway. I'm happy to talk about this stuff. It's all about hallway traffic. So with that. Well, thanks so much, and have an awesome rest of your DevFest.